I know the title is a bit dramatic with 5 reasons no one uses watercolor pencils ever, but the reason I'm making this video is because I've been using watercolor pencils for 2 years now, and it kills me to see that so many artists own a box that they're not using still, and if they are, it's going to be rare and it's going to be for a sketch or a small touch of something on a painting. Now this is why if you're feeling seen right now, I'm telling you, you might be missing out. With such gorgeous boxes of pencils, there's gotta be something great to create, don't you think? Hi, I'm Françoise, I'm a watercolor artist, and my mission for the past 2 years has been to teach watercolor pencils so you can learn about them here on YouTube with over 25 watercolor pencils videos, but also Skillshare with 3 popular classes that I've made and my Patreon with many real-time tutorials. And I'll add links to all of this in the description of the video. So I'm not going to keep the suspense going here for very long because the main reasons why people aren't using watercolor pencils is simply because they don't know their potential since there's so little to be found about them. And now I'm going to share 5 reasons why this medium is so underrated. I'll be using the Derwent graphite tint pencils, which are not traditional watercolor pencils since there's graphite particles in them, but still they work just the same with the same techniques, same look in a painting, so let's go. The first reason why watercolor pencils are so underrated is that most people ignore that they can create quick and smooth washes of paint just like watercolor. And that's why here I'm using a palette with a rough texture to get pigment out of the pencils. You can do that and then wet the pigment to get a ready-to-use swatch of paint, or like me, you can pre-wet the palette or the sheet of watercolor paper that serves as a palette if you don't have a palette. And I do that, I pre-wet it because I find it quicker that way. I find that the pigment melts right on my palette, and it also avoids those little bits of pigments to end up on my paper. It happened to me before, especially with a type of water-soluble pencils that's called Derwent Inktense. Not watercolor pencils, but again, they work just the same. And with these especially, if you end up with a little bit of pigment on your paper and you wet it by mistake because you didn't see it, then it just gets fixed there and it's harder to remove than if it was just blended before. So that's why I like to pre-wet the palette and then apply the pigment. Notice how easy it is to use that technique, even with a watercolor pencil, and even mix colors before painting anything. That would be, I think, one of the things that might scare some of us off, but in fact, you can really do everything with these pencils. That's also why now I'm able to create a dreamy background that looks exactly like watercolor. And one of the things that I've been asked often is, what is the point then? Why use watercolor pencils and not just watercolor? And yes, it's valid. I get why a lot of people have said that. It's a normal question to ask. But what I think is that you can use watercolor if you want. But if, like me, you want a 100% watercolor pencil creation, to just say that you've created that art piece with just watercolor pencils, then it's a great way to do it. And also, if you're on the go and you prefer to take these over your watercolors, I think that's a convenient technique to know about. I also think that for someone who isn't comfortable diving into the world of watercolor right away, who's not used to using water or using a paintbrush, it happened to me when I started watercolors, then I think that the watercolor pencils are a little bit less intimidating. And a huge plus with them is that you really don't need to use that much water at all. So overall, they're easier to control than watercolor. They might seem a little bit more easy to use. The second reason why watercolor pencils are so underrated is that most people ignore that they can be used with a wide variety of papers. They don't even have to be high quality papers all the time. And you can get fantastic results. It's far beyond what most imagine when all we know them for is a way to sketch for a traditional watercolor painting, or just a quick way to draw something simple that kind of looks like watercolors, and that's going to be fun for just 5 minutes. For example, here I'm using them on this Beta sketchbook by Stillman and Byrne. The paper is watercolor, but it can only take a little bit of water. And it's not near as fancy as the 100% cotton watercolor papers that I like to use, like Arche. And still, I've used my pencils on several types of papers. The very best cotton papers, again, Arche or plenty of other ones that I like, with great results. But I've also used them on drawing papers that aren't even supposed to work with water-soluble mediums. And my results were still great. And I documented all of that in this comparison video here that I will link in the description if you need to find it back. The reason why it's so easy to use all these papers with watercolor pencils is that you need just a tad of water. And that makes them really easy to use. So as long as the paper is not super thin, it's going to work. I would also stay away from the ones that either are very textured or very smooth, as in glossy smooth. A rough texture with big hills and valleys in your paper surface will make your strokes hard to blend, while a glossy, smooth paper would make it really hard for the pigment to even grab onto the surface. And I'm imagining it would be very limiting when you like to add layers to a piece of art. But still, outside of that, you have plenty of options. I would recommend cold press watercolor papers or thick drawing papers that you know are good quality. Like I know Strathmore has that one that I used in the video that I mentioned before. A third reason why watercolor pencils are so underrated is that a lot of people ignore that you can create dreamy, loose backgrounds like the one that I just made, but you can also balance that with realistic effects. That's why now the paper and background are dry. I use the pencils as colored pencils. The coloring technique is logical for me to use right now because I want these berries to stand out against the loose background. If I color, there'll be more precision in where the color goes and how several colors overlap in a specific spot. It'll be easier for me to decide and to render that on paper. I can also play with pressure in places where I know that the twigs or berries need to look darker. And in general, coloring is better to deposit more pigment on paper quickly. Whenever we work on wet, like I showed you before, the pigment gets dissolved into the water and it's going to look not only softer, but also way lighter. A fourth reason why watercolor pencils are so rarely seen in the art community is that most people ignore, I think, that they're so easy to work with and also incredibly forgiving. First of all, they are not hard to erase if you don't press like crazy when you color. Most of the pigment will come off. Then they don't need a lot of water to get activated, as I touched on before, and that makes them easier to control. Now, the difficulty here that probably frustrated many and led them to give up on the medium, like I did actually, is that there is a way to activate and blend colors that will work well with these. What I mean is that if you just wet a paintbrush with a lot of water and brush it over everything, all the colors will mix together and you'll end up with a muddy mess. The thing is that with watercolor pencils, you need to be a little more strategic about the way you blend things, but it's really nothing complicated. And I teach my technique to do just that. For example, the tutorial for these berries is on Patreon, but you can also watch other videos on the topic on my YouTube channel, and you'll learn a great deal about that. Another thing I love about watercolor pencils is that it's possible to create a dreamy watercolor-like effect on an area where the coloring technique was used. All you need to do is add more water all around the part that you want to blend for soft edges to appear, and do a little bit of back and forth on the colored part to encourage the pigment to blend well and maybe even get a little bit lighter than the rest. So you see how easy it is to touch up even a loose background. And again, this all comes down to how much water you use. Use more water for a softer and looser look and less for more control. If you take one thing away from this video, that'd be the thing to remember. As you can see, watercolor pencils are also easy to layer, just like watercolor or any other medium. It's easy to touch up what you want, like I just showed you before. You can even change the shape of something or just add depth and vibrancy to the art with another layer. They're also really easy to lift on wet especially. So again, there's a lot to be done. The fifth reason why watercolor pencils are so underrated is that most people think they're limiting creativity, which is obviously not the case, as I think you've seen in this video so far. For example, I created a loose background. I also made these berries pop against it and look realistic enough. And I could push this even further if I wanted to. This is just a quick sketchbook illustration, so I just wanted to do something simple. But I've painted portraits before with just watercolor pencils, and this one in particular looks so realistic. And I love it's so easy to finish a watercolor pencil painting with strong shadows by just layering and adding pressure to deposit more pigment with darker colors. But it's also easy to add the final highlights, what makes a whole painting pop even more. And I like to wet the lead of a white watercolor pencil to do that and just deposit the melted chunks of pigment on paper directly. The challenge for you now is to tell me in the comments if you're using watercolor pencils or if you will be after this video, hopefully. And you can watch this video next to learn a little trick I like to use with my pencils for realism, and that was something I did in the same sketchbook. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time!